It's Sarah Spain in the FOS studios today. Sarah, congratulations on recently winning the 2025 Social Impact Award at the iHeart Podcast Awards. What was that moment like for you when you were able to get recognized for your hard work in covering women's sports?
It was really cool. It feels like I've been at it for a long time. And finally, lots of other people are catching up to not just how great women's sports are, but what an economic opportunity it is. And so, first of all, there's an award show for podcasts, which is cool. I think there's such an outsized influence on the media space now, but we're still catching up in terms of really representing podcasts alongside other things that have had a long historic run in terms of both awards, but also recognition. And then Ed Helms presented me with the award from The Office and The Hangover. And I went to Cornell, so I've been sent his memed face like 500 plus times. Cornell, ever heard of it? So it was kind of fun and serendipitous that he was the one who gave me the award.
Yeah, a great moment for you, and overall from Ed Helms to just the award itself, because for decades you have been one that's consistently involved in sports coverage, specifically one of the voices in women's sports that are amplifying athletes, talking about investments, better coverage, the need for better infrastructure, and many more topics that you've been able to discuss. What have you noticed as the positive changes that have been happening in sports, for women specifically?
Well, yeah, I mean, investment. And as much as we don't like to have to depend on the rich people with the money to get things going, a lot of times that's the difference. And in women's sports, for such a long time, there was this expectation of immediate return on investment, or any loss was some sort of referendum on the product itself. And in men's sports, there's so much time for them to be treated like a startup. There's a belief in the potential long term, and so losses are an expected part of starting a new league or starting a new team. And in women's sports, that wasn't allowed. And now we're seeing the kind of investment that's required over the long term to give time for growth and marketing and sponsorships and all these things to pick up. And we're seeing that across the WNBA, NWSL, PWHL, unrivaled, all these different spaces, which is awesome. And then the other thing that I think is really important as someone who, like you said, has been in the media space for so long, at ESPN in particular, I worked across so many different spaces: radio, podcast, television, writing, men's predominantly, women's predominantly, and then 13 years of radio, which is kind of playing the hits and trying to get more women's stories covered. And one thing I noticed is in men's sports, we do such a good job of giving people a connective tissue between games and events to tell them to come back. Here's the stories, stars, stakes, and stats that you need to care, not just about the game you just watched, but to come back next week and watch again. And in women's sports, far too often it was, new season's here, we'll check back in at the end. A championship won, we'll check back in next year. And all those things that happened in between weren't really talked about enough for fans to know and care. And so part of the reason for Good Game with Sarah Spain is so that every single day people can wake up and hear the news and stories and all the things going on and then get great interviews and conversations. But I think it's a no-brainer, but something we haven't really been able, or people in charge haven't been willing to do in the media space.
Yeah, and you bring up so many great points, starting with the fact of continuously covering players, the storylines throughout the course of the season. But as someone, as you mentioned, that does wear many hats in sports, you talk about the men's and women's side, I'm curious to know, personally, how does that overlap work for you in terms of Good Game with Sarah Spain and your iHeartRadio podcast, but also your work with ESPN to overlap in the different roles that you have?
So right now it's great because I'm just working for ESPNW, which is the women's sports, and then iHeart is all women's sports. But for years there was this balance of working for ESPNW and trying to get those stories into the mainstream spaces. And I mean, that's the fascinating part about being behind the scenes at all these different elements. You see in radio, it's a little bit more old school. You have time, you have 2 to 3 hours, you have a community that you create, and you have time to have conversation, but they do really push for play the big stories, talk about the things people are most interested in. And I had to work to really get some of the women's stories told. On Around the Horn, I found that there were great producers, and Tony Reale, who were really interested in highlighting women's sports, even in these small little chunks whenever possible. I think the main thing that's really changed the game is the gatekeepers, whether that's program directors, newspaper editors, producers. They're the ones who ultimately decide what people are interested in. They try to read the audience. And for such a long time, that has been predominantly middle-aged cis white men who go to the same 4 major men's pro sports and check the news every morning. NFL, NBA, NHL, and MLB. Those are all the things we're checking. And then occasionally there might be a tennis or golf thing that steps in. What we found happened in the last couple of years, and particularly with Caitlin Clark versus Angel Reese, was all of a sudden they had a new tab to check. Is there any big news in that space right now? Because people were clamoring for it. And once that door was opened, where they had to go looking and see if there was something in college basketball. And then when Caitlin got to the WNBA, in the professional leagues, now they're more likely to just keep a mind open to something from the NWSL or PWHL or Unrivaled that might break through and make their shows. And that to me is the biggest sea change after decades, literal decades, almost the entirety of the sports media industry since ESPN and other things started, of going to the same place every day. They've opened up their minds.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, ESPN has been in those spaces. I mean, we look at college women's basketball right now, for example, as we're in the midst of all the chaos and excitement around March Madness. It's the 30th year of ESPN having the exclusive coverage of the college basketball tournament for women specifically. But it's also how networks are covering it. You look at the ESPN College Game Day, for example, of Elle, Shanae, and Andrea doing a fantastic job. The big three. They've got analysis, it's personality, it's storylines, it's different in how sports are being covered now. You know, when you look at ESPN specifically as someone that's on the inside, has worked in so many aspects of ESPN, they are the leading charge for sports coverage, and a lot of networks follow suit on based on what ESPN does. How do you see ESPN really changing in how they're looking to amplify and cover women's sports?
Yeah, it's the shoulder programming like you mentioned. Before, it was great to have rights packages, but you would tune in, watch a game, and that was it. And oftentimes even you might go straight from a double overtime March Madness thriller to a Sports Center where they don't mention that game for the first 25 minutes. And you're sort of like, wait, what happened, right? So it's that synergy, it's that talking across different spaces at the network that has improved a ton, I think. And then the shoulder programming, the understanding that the stories need to be told in order for people to be engaged. And especially in spaces where there wasn't a lot of investment in storytelling and there wasn't a lot of marketing and sponsorship, and yet you still saw these big numbers, it kind of woke them up. I remember a couple years ago, there was a regular season game between UConn and Iowa. Caitlin Clark was just kind of making a name for herself. Paige Becker's obviously a big name at the time. And it was on ABC on a Sunday, and ESPN did a fair amount of promotion for it. And it was 5 million viewers. Absolutely massive number, because they just told people, this is what you're watching for. This up-and-coming star who's the top scorer in the country, and this superstar who's leading the way for Player of the Year at the time. And I think that's been the biggest thing, is not just get the rights packages, but then incorporate it into your other shows. Incorporate it into spaces where fans are watching and might find a storyline compelling and then go looking for it. And you know, I think ESPN is rightly criticized sometimes for not doing enough, and yet they're also miles ahead of everyone else in terms of the amount of hours of women's sports that they have. I think for me, part of the reason for Good Game with Sarah Spain and starting this iHeart podcast was to fill those spaces. You know, if every day you turn on SportsCenter or First Take or Around the Horn and you don't see the storylines, it's hard to keep up. And so to have literally the only place, whether it's TV, radio, podcast, or even web, where every single day when you turn it on, I'm going to tell you what the storylines and the biggest news is. That to me is so behind. I mean, we're decades behind where we should have that for women's sports when you can get that in any number of places for men. So I think sort of combining shoulder programming with the pre and post game shows and complementary podcasts and stories and feature storytelling is really the future and where we have to keep pushing.
It is, and a big part of that, when you look at the sports coverage, is the voices behind the sports coverage. I know partly why when I was transitioning out of playing soccer into covering, it was because those voices I felt like needed to be present for women as well. On the men's side, you talk about ESPN specifically, the deals that we've seen for a Stephen A. Smith, 5-year deal, $100 million, Pat McAfee, 5 years as well. The names go on and on. The women that are analysts, that are voices like yourself, that have shows, that have a consistent voice in sports coverage, is slowly changing. But I'm interested in your thoughts on just the investment in really getting those full-time, consistent female voices that have the passion, the volume, the experience, not just talking women's sports, but talking sports in general, that are changing in the industry.
I mean, it's been night and day since when I started. I literally didn't even want to get into sports. It was basically, I thought women who looked like supermodels on the sideline, perfect hair, perfect everything, and they didn't have a lot of room to have personality. It was, here's what I talked to the coach about, here's the injury. And I thought, that's not really me. I'm full of opinions. I got a lot to say about a lot of things. And I gave it a shot, kind of by accident, and realized it was this intersection of so many things I cared about, and I just had to decide to do it my own way. I did Second City Improv Conservatory. I brought all the comedy and the sort of extemporaneous thought and the back and forth and all that to the space in a way that I thought was missing for women being allowed to be that way. And what it used to be was a lot of hosts facilitating men's opinions. we were sideline reporters or we were hosts. And now the breadth of it is on display. Everything in the media, from color commentary, play-by-play, analysts, opinionists, all the way up to owners and GMs and everything else in the ownership space, in the front office space. I think the thing that still needs to be expanded a little bit is physical examples and representations of every kind. I think there's a lot more women of color, but we still have this expectation of beauty and perfection that men don't have, frankly. You can look like anyone and you can find a job if you know your stuff. And I think women still are. My hair is fake. My lashes are fake. Most everything else is real. My teeth are real. Everything's real.
Wait a minute now.
We don't need to get into every single detail. But I have to work so hard to keep up with stuff that's not that important to me, because otherwise I don't get a space to share my knowledge and my talent. And I think that that's still a barrier in a lot of ways, is women and the expectations for them to be everything the men have to be in terms of prepared and knowledgeable, and then on top of that have all the right clothes and everything else. So I would love to see some more representations of women that,
Yeah, and we've talked about that ourselves.
Yeah.
That's a whole other conversation that we can get into a can of worms of just how women have to show up and how they're covering sports. But something you mentioned is being multifaceted, and I know you have a book. Your first book, titled "Runs in the Family: An incredible true story of football, fatherhood, and belonging," with DeLand McCullough. Just expanding on that viral article you had back in 2018 covering his personal life. I'm curious to know, how is that going with the book being released June 3rd this year, which is very exciting. Just the preparation for that, the process behind that, and even just the inspiration of taking that viral article and moment and putting it into a book that you worked with DeLand on.
So Dylan was teammates with my friend Skip in college, and Skip came to me with this story, and in like a 3-minute telling of it, I already had the chills. I was on the verge of tears. It was such an incredible story. And then it blew up so much when we did the story for E60 and the long-form feature written story for ESPN that movie folks came, book folks came, and I was so busy at the time that it wasn't the right time to sit down and write. It's very overwhelming to imagine writing a whole book. I'm like amazed that I did it. But then I had time more recently, and it was incredible. I mean, Dylan and his family trusting me to tell his story, trusting me with their most intimate and difficult and challenging moments in life. It's ultimately a heartwarming story. There's a lot in there about ending cycles of generational trauma, about football, about family, about how we decide to unearth secrets and start talking about them and how that ultimately heals us. But first, it's hard. And I think there's so much for people to connect to. There's a twist that people might already know that's already out there, but I won't spoil it for those who don't. It's just a really incredible story. Whenever people hear it, they're like, that sounds fake. That's got to be a movie. And we're like, well, hopefully it will be. But yeah, the book comes out June 3rd. You can pre-order it now. And I just think, it runs the gamut of people who will be interested, whether they're sports fans or just fans of an incredible story.
So needed. And just so refreshing to hear this vulnerable story coming out and just sharing and giving a chance to peel back the layers. And, for you, Sarah, you work in so many different components of not only sports coverage, but storytelling and the overall ability to just use your platform in a positive way. So with your book coming out June 3rd, I'm sure there's more on the horizon. What else can you tease out that we can expect from you this year? Will your work with ESPN continue in the same capacity? Are you looking to do anything different and evolve in any ways in your career?
Oh my gosh, it's a big question. I'm still figuring it out. This is my first book, so I'm really interested in the ride. What does it actually look like, promoting it, having it be out in the world, talking about it, all of that. So I'm really excited for that to finally make it out. It's the longest thing I've ever worked on without it being received. Like radio and TV, it's like you do the prep, you do the work, people respond immediately. This is a couple years of work before anything is out there. Good Game with Sarah Spain, where we've got WNBA All-Star Weekend, NWSL Championships. We might be headed to the Winter Olympics for that coverage. So lots of good stuff there. And I also really want to start rolling out some series that introduce people to, as I mentioned, the story, stakes, stats, and stars from the leagues that they want to get into that they might not know yet. Just some more 101s for people to help them kind of like dive into something that might not be, the wheelhouse for them, whether that's hockey or lacrosse or something else. And then, ESPNW, we have our annual fall summit in Ojai, California. So just working with them, we just did campus conversations talking to all the UCLA varsity female athletes about next steps in life and what it's going to look like once they graduate. So It's just great to be involved in a bunch of different places. I was a heptathlete in college, so basically just like could not pick one thing, have to do all the things. That's kind of how I've treated my professional life. So I'm just enjoying it, and whatever comes my way, I'm open to.
Yeah, a heptathlete to now a heptat professional.
There we go. We'll make up a word for it.
Hepta professional.
We'll workshop
Yes,
it. We'll workshop it.
We'll figure that out. But Sarah, thank you so much for your time. It's incredible to see all the fantastic work you're doing with your show, with your coverage, with just your storytelling as well, and excited for your book to be released. So
thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you for your time, and for you guys, stay with Front Office Sports for the latest on the business of sports and culture.